What if the most famous sermon in history isn't just something to admire as a fine piece of literature, but a blueprint for how followers of Jesus are actually meant to live? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus lays out a radical vision of what life in his kingdom looks like. It's not about some kind of religion. It's not about reputation. It's about transformation from the inside out. In Matthew chapter 5, Jesus flips the world's values upside down, or perhaps right side up, blessing the poor, the humble, the persecuted. He calls us to be salt and light, to live differently in a world that's lost its way. Some time ago, I did a devotional series on the Sermon on the Mount. A couple dozen short teachings working through Matthew chapter 5 and 6 and 7. We call these weekly words. Now these teachings have been compiled into this 3-part series walking through the Sermon on the Mount. Feel free to use these devotionally, in your small group, or as part of your study on this foundational teaching of Jesus. He called his disciples to make disciples, teaching them to obey everything he commanded. And so these passages, this series isn't just about accumulating knowledge, but about adjusting the way we live to the kingdom Jesus is establishing. Welcome to Matthew chapter 5, part 1 in the Sermon on the Mount. The first substantial passage of scripture I ever memorized was the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. It's one of Jesus' most significant blocks of teaching. And we're going to be picking through the Sermon on the Mount over the next few weeks. But I want to start right at the beginning, the opening words that are so easy to skip over. Because at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount it says, "Now when he saw the crowds," that's Jesus, "when he saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him and he began to teach them, saying," and then he launches into the Sermon on the Mount. What's interesting to note here is that he saw the crowds, so he taught his disciples. Now, the crowds, of course, heard the sermon and they, I'm sure, benefited from it, or at least were puzzled by it. It says at the end of the sermon they were amazed by it, actually. But I think it's really important as disciple makers to understand that Jesus was really, his basic plan was disciple making. He saw the crowds, he saw the great need, he saw the masses, and so he taught his disciples. He trained his disciples because he knew that the key, the secret, was multiplication. That the way he was going to actually change the world, the way the kingdom was going to come, was not just from him, teaching everybody and healing everybody and doing everything, but through multiplying himself through his disciples. And so I want you to maybe, by way of application for this very short weekly word, just by way of application, I think what you should do is just read through the sermon and think about it not from the perspective of the crowds, but from the perspective of a disciple. What was Jesus trying to teach his disciples? What was he trying to instill in them? What was the shift in thinking? What was he trying to reproduce in them and through them that then they would reproduce and pass on to others? He saw the crowds, he sat down, his disciples came to him, he taught them. He taught them so that they could teach others, so that they could be agents of the kingdom. Take a look at the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, and see what exactly it was Jesus was trying to filter into, maybe drill into the heads and hearts of his disciples. Continuing on with the Sermon on the Mount, we saw last week how really Jesus called his disciples to him when he saw the crowds and began teaching. He begins with what we call the Beatitudes. "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now, I'm not going to unpack every bit of the phrase in this list here. Just note that he's using the word blessed, which is really a deep, beyond happiness. It's just a total sense of God's favor and being in the right spot. And he's saying that these are the people who are blessed. And what's important to note, and this is really the setup for the entire sermon, is that the people he says are blessed are not the same people that maybe the world would say are blessed. He talks about being poor in spirit and mourning and the meek, which is not typically a list of things you would add to, successful, blessed people on this planet. It's a very different list. And then it gets into hungering and thirsting for righteousness, which isn't a known trait for success in our world. And being merciful and pure in heart and peacemaking, and then persecution. And we're going to unpack persecution a bit next week. But the thing to note here is that the values Jesus is laying out in the Beatitudes and in the rest of the Sermon on the Mount are countercultural values. They're the exact opposite of the kinds of things the world would say are blessed and successful and good and proper. And again, I would encourage you to read through the Sermon on the Mount again and just try to identify the things that are countercultural, because you just keep bumping into it again and again and again. And what Jesus is doing here is laying out the kingdom culture. A different way of thinking, a different way of acting, a different value system. And we see them kind of summed up here in the Beatitudes. So take a look, maybe memorize this list, reflect on it, and say, how am I called to be different? And we're going to see something about difference in a couple of weeks as we look into salt and light and what that actually means. The tail end of the Beatitudes flags the issue of persecution. The very last in the primary list in verse 10 says, moves from peacemakers in verse 9 to persecuted, which is interesting because often those who are peacemakers tend towards getting persecuted, because the world, our culture, our governments have a bias towards making enemies. There's nothing more unifying than having a common enemy. And so those who try to make peace try to eliminate enemies, and it just puts you in line for persecution. Anyway, verse 10 it says, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then Jesus kind of expands on it, addressing his disciples. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So there's many reasons given here for persecution. One, righteousness. You're doing what is right. And sometimes doing what is right can lead to opposition and persecution, in case you haven't noticed. So the fact that you're facing opposition doesn't mean you're out of God's will. In fact, it may mean that you're exactly in the center of God's will. Don't use opposition or persecution as a clue that you're somehow out of line. Jesus is saying you may well be completely in line with me and my kingdom. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. He's saying you're going to be persecuted, you're going to be lied about and insulted because of your identification with me. And we see that in some cultures very uniquely. I've known of Christians in predominantly Muslim cultures who are kind of mocked for being Christian. And it's kind of seen, it's used in a sense, the first century way, the initial way, it's used as an insult to call someone a Christian. And basically Jesus is saying, if you identify with me, there's going to be some opposition. And people are going to ridicule you because the way of Christ is so different. I just saw an excerpt from a Joe Rogan podcast a while ago where he's talking about how stupid Christianity is. And he basically describes this idea of who Jesus is and the way the Christian faith works, and this idea of someone dying and all that. He just thought it was so stupid. And that's exactly what Jesus is talking about here. It seems kind of goofy that God would become human. That's mind-blowing for a lot of religions and cultures. And then rather than taking over, he dies. So it just seems so out of whack. And that's part of the anti-popular culture, pro-kingdom culture we see here. So Jesus says, whatever you're insulted or persecuted for in relation to following me, here's what you're supposed to do in response. And this is a challenge. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now, I don't know about you, but the last thing I would think of doing when being persecuted, would be rejoicing and being glad. But Jesus says very clearly here, if you are persecuted, insulted because of me, because of your identification with me, then that actually accrues to your eternal benefit. In one of the Timothys, Paul's writing in Timothy and says, everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. And so that is just part and parcel of what it means to follow Jesus, what it means to be a disciple. And as we seek to make disciples, we need to make sure we're upfront about that we don't teach this idea that if you follow Jesus, everything will just be peachy and everything will be good. No, there's going to be some opposition, even for doing the right thing. And Jesus, kind of inoculates us against getting discouraged, saying, listen, if that happens, you're on the right track and it's being noted and your reward is great. So where do you need to take a stand this week for what is right? Where do you need to identify with Jesus? Don't be surprised if it leads to some opposition, some insult, some persecution, but then just kind of smile quietly to yourself and say, a little bit more of that eternal reward is coming my way. There's a whole mountain of raspberry bushes here. Kind of nice. Perhaps one of the most easily understood segments of the Sermon on the Mount is this passage on salt and light, where Jesus says to his disciples again, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It's no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on its stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. Two little metaphors here, salt and light. He says to his disciples, this is what you are. Salt permeates. Salt makes a difference. It's not so much the idea of adding a flavor, but of permeating and really preserving in some way. That's the intent of the salt metaphor here. But it says, if salt isn't salty, what's the point? You're just throwing rock on your food. It doesn't preserve anything. It doesn't add flavor to anything. It just doesn't work. It's good for nothing. So salt, by its very nature, needs to be salty. It needs to permeate and make a difference and preserve. Similarly, and the metaphors are related, they overlap in a lot of ways, the idea of light, saying if there's light, if there's a city that's up on a hill and lit up, you can't hide it. It just stands right out. I've lived in communities where as you're driving towards, maybe you've seen 60 miles out from a big city, you can see the glow in the sky and see that city coming. It can't be hidden. Similarly to the city, you don't light a lamp Similarly to the city, you don't light a lamp or turn on a light and cover it all up. The whole point of the lamp, is to give light to the room. And then so he says, okay, like this, the city that can't be hidden, this light gives light to the room. Let your light shine. Make it obvious that you're one of mine, so that people can see what you're doing and give glory to your Father in heaven. There's actually more packed in here than typically we pay attention to. But basically he's saying, just make it obvious whose you are. And in some cases that will, yes, bring persecution. We saw that. But in some cases it will bring glory to God. We see in the New Testament, in the book of Acts, how as the church did the church stuff, people had great favor towards them, but they were also persecuted. So it kind of cuts both ways. But the idea is just to be obvious. Be obviously Jesus. Be obviously countercultural in the right way. Be that salt that permeates. Be that light that brings a different view, a different value system to the darkness. And that is one of the ways in which people are pointed to God, the revelation of the work of Christ in us and through us. So where do you need to be salty salt? Where do you need to be a bright light? Where are you called to, bring back the saltiness or take the cover off the light? That's really the challenge and the question for this week. A city on a hill can't be hidden. You don't light a lamp, put it under a bowl. So this week, in what way do you need to take a stand and be clearly a follower of Jesus? Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5:17. Do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. The way this passage is taken really does affect the way you view the Old Testament, the way you view Christianity and Judaism, and it isn't fully explained here. You've got to, go out from here as well into the New Testament, into Hebrews and those kind of things. But the point Jesus is making here is that with his coming, the Old Testament law and the prophets were all pointing to him. He has now fulfilled that the prophecies about him were fulfilled and being fulfilled. That's really pointing to him. So it's not like that he's erasing them. All those prophecies and all those principles and everything that's pointing to him still stands and is going to stand, and the prophecies that have yet to be fulfilled from the Old Testament will still be fulfilled. He's not erasing all of those things. And so he's basically saying, don't write off. Don't write off the Old Testament. Don't write off the law and the prophets. Now, he is, in verse 20, unless we think he's, saying you really have to be a Jew to be a Christian, which we know is not the case, he makes it really clear in verse 20, unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's pointing to a different righteousness, which he lays out in the Sermon on the Mount, which is, let's be honest, an impossible standard. He's saying it's not that the Pharisees weren't good, they weren't good enough. They weren't perfect. And he doesn't explain how you achieve that righteousness. He's just saying that keeping that checklist of laws they were keeping, those externals, wasn't enough. And as he goes on through the Sermon on the Mount, he starts pointing to the internals. And it's not just about keeping external, but keeping the heart intent of those laws, which, as we go through, we'll see is not something you can just do in your own strength. In fact, Jesus is the one who has to fulfill the law even in us. He's the one who kept it all perfectly. And so, he's really in these opening verses of the Sermon on the Mount kind of laying down the framework. It's a counterculture. It's really about a different way of thinking and doing. And then it's about a different standard of righteousness. And we're going to see as we keep picking through some of the standards. And there's one in particular, one point at which, as I was going through the Sermon on the Mount, memorizing it, completely hammered me when I realized the point of this is not to say, here's the checklist. The point of this is to say, you can't do it in your own strength. You need outside help. And so think about everything you knew about the Old Testament. Think about all of the ways it points to Jesus, continues to point to Jesus. It is about him. The Old Testament was about him. The New Testament was about him. So in our following of him, in our disciple making, he is front and center. He fulfills the Old Testament. He's the one to which it pointed, and he's the one to which we must be oriented as we go through life. That's what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Welcome to this weekly word for September 12th. We're back in the Sermon on the Mount, and in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21, we read this. You've heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the Sanhedrin. Anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, this is like the application of that. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to that person, then come and offer your gift. This is the first of several times where Jesus says, you've heard that it was said, but I say to you. And he's really amping up the law, moving it from the outside to the inside. And in this case, he's really talking about relationships and prioritizing, get this, relationships with one another over public worship. He says, if you're offering your gift at the altar, remember you have a broken relationship, fix that, then come back and worship. So it's a very, very simple thought, very simple application today. I wonder what would happen in the world, in churches, if believers, when they came to worship, had cleared up all the relational things they possibly could. You know, if somebody doesn't want to make things right with you, you can't fix it. You know, as far as it's possible, live at peace with everyone. But imagine if that was our priority. If we fought to make things right like we fight to get to church. It's been very interesting this season of physical restrictions where we sometimes can't meet physically. But we could probably still right relationships. And here in this passage, Jesus says that's the priority. Prioritize right relationship with each other from that foundation, from that posture, worship. So that any open-ended relationships you need to deal with, any loose ends, any forgiveness to extend or receive or ask for, prioritize that this weekend. God bless. Press on. Welcome to this weekly word on September 26th, and we are in Matthew chapter 5 at verse 27, where it says, you've heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It's better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Challenging passage. And what Jesus does here, he continues to go from outward righteousness towards inward righteousness. Previous segment we saw about murder. He says, yeah, murder's wrong, but so is hatred. Here he says, yes, adultery of course is wrong, but so is lust. It's on the same level. It's not the same thing, but it's on the same level. It is also sin. Just because something is going on inside you, as opposed to, acting it out, it doesn't mean that it's righteous. It doesn't mean that it's okay. And this enhancement or strengthening of what purity really means and holiness really means goes on through this entire sermon. And at some point, I believe every person who reads it through, at some point, there'll be a challenge to them where maybe we'll be feeling self-righteous, but one of these things we'll realize on the inside, we're not all there. And maybe this is the one for you. I'll share the one when I first memorized this passage. One of these segments that Jesus taught on really got me right between the eyes. It wasn't actually this one. It was one that we're going to get to in a few weeks, Lord willing. But the point is, again, purity and holiness is so deep and so thorough, far beyond human standards of style. It's really about substance. And Jesus calls us to heart level purity. The next segment, there's that verse about adultery and lust. And then he talks about, if your right eye causes you to sin, if your right hand causes you to sin, chop it off. I kind of wonder if it's related, if, the adultery passage and the chop off body parts thing is related or not. There's a story about an early church father named Origen who castrated himself, actually not based on this passage, based on another one that talked about some people making themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven. It's unclear whether it actually happened. But the idea Jesus is getting at here is, it's true. It is better to lose a body part than to go to hell. No question about it. But I don't think Jesus is saying, chop off body parts to prevent sin. It's pretty clear that what he's saying is, if there's something that you're engaged with, something you're doing, something even that may be dear to you, that is drawing you away, that's pulling you to sin, deal with it decisively and brutally. For some people, cutting off the right hand to prevent sin might mean, downgrading their phone and getting offline a little bit more. It might mean doing some other practices, things that are dear and important to you, just dealing with them completely. It might be a relationship. It might be a habit. It might be, some kind of addiction. It might be something you watch or the kinds of things you watch online. And if those things are drawing you away, whether into impurity or something else that is contrary to Christ, Jesus is saying, deal with it. Chop it off. And so if you pray, the Psalm 139 prayer, we bounce on this quite a bit, where it says, "Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting." When you pray that, if something comes to mind, then apply this passage that Jesus taught on and deal with it decisively and brutally. And when you do that, you clear the way for a deeper walk, a deeper work, and moving down the path to Christ-likeness. It's a work of the Spirit. It's not that you make yourself good. It's responding to the promptings of the Spirit and the things He's saying to you. The Christian life is simply hearing the voice of the Lord, the Spirit and the Word, and taking the next step of obedience. That's the heart of the Christian life. That's what it means to follow Jesus. So take the next step in following Him today, whatever that looks like. God bless. Press on. Welcome back to this weekly word. We are still in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Today we're in chapter 5, verses 31 and 32, a very short snippet about divorce, where Jesus says, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, causes her to become an adulteress. And anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery." This is not the only passage Jesus teaches on. My understanding contextually is that this was a bit of a corrective to the easy divorce that had been set up by the religious leaders, a willingness to divorce their wives for really any and every reason. And Jesus saying, no, there's something wrong with that. And apart from sexual immorality, you really shouldn't be divorcing them at all. That phrase where it says, if he divorces her, it causes her to become adulteress, that my understanding is that's because a woman who was all of a sudden single really would have to do whatever she could to make a living, and would really be left to fend for herself, and would probably be involved in either prostitution or having to hook up with some other fellow. And so really the point of the passage is, to sum up, God isn't for divorce. In Malachi in the Old Testament, it says God hates divorce. And you know why God hates divorce? It's because He loves people. Because divorce is carnage. Divorce goes to the soul. It's extremely devastating, both for the partners and for any children. It's interesting, I've seen and heard of people saying, well, the kids, they can handle it. They're young, they're resilient. No, not at all. Yeah, kids are young and resilient, but it does deep damage to them. And I'm belaboring the point here a bit, not to impose guilt on someone who might have gone through divorce, but just to flag how serious divorce is and what a breach it is, and the reason that God is opposed to it, because He wants what's best for us. Jesus seems to give the exception here. If there's sexual immorality, okay, divorce in that case might be acceptable, but it's not required. It's not demanded. And I would just say anyone contemplating divorce, or even counseling people who are contemplating divorce, be very careful of pulling that trigger. Be very careful of making a break final and complete, because there are huge implications, both for the individuals, for the gospel, if they're believers, for the cause of Christ. So let's walk through this carefully. What it means then for those of us maybe who aren't in a situation of facing divorce or impending divorce is really to value marriage, to pray for marriages, not to in any way become a wedge between people who are married, trying to play them off one another, or trying to compromise, even if you're, friends with, if you're a man friends with a husband, not to pull him away from his wife needlessly. Likewise, wife, you're a lady who's friends with a wife, not to pull them apart needlessly, but to create space and do what you can to support and encourage that marriage. My wife refuses to lie, even for the sake of a good practical joke. It's really quite irritating sometimes. I, on the other hand, have been known to contribute to a story to, make for a good practical joke. The result of this, one of the results was that when our children were young, if I would be pulling their leg in some measure or saying something they didn't quite know if was true, they'd go ask Mom, because they knew that Mom will always tell the truth. Welcome back to the Weekly Word. This week we are in Matthew chapter 5, verse 33, where Jesus says, "Again you've heard that it was said to the people long ago, Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made. But I tell you, do not swear on oaths at all, either by heaven, for it's God's throne, or by the earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it's the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. Jesus is addressing a situation here where people were not always telling the truth. And particularly, they had these layers of oaths where certain oaths were more significant than others because they were more aligned with the name of Yahweh. And the closer aligned to Yahweh, the more binding the oath was, which means that there's these kind of spectrum of how binding an oath was. In fact, according to my one commentary here, swearing by heaven and earth was not binding. Neither was swearing by Jerusalem. However, if you swore toward Jerusalem, that was somehow binding. That's the situation Jesus is addressing here. And he cuts through all of it and simply says, just tell the truth. Oath or no oath, just tell the truth. Now, some people have taken this to mean that you shouldn't, take an oath in court or swear in court. And, that's commendable. That seems like perhaps an accurate application. We do see that the Apostle Paul took oaths and supported the idea of oaths within the Jewish religious system after this moment. So it wasn't that it was wrong to take an oath. The idea simply was, no matter whether you take an oath or not, tell the truth. Now, how that applies to practical jokes, we can debate. My wife takes it one way, I take it the other way. But practical jokes aside, let your yes be yes and your no, no. And I think right away back to Psalm 15, where it talks about the kind of person that really is aligned with God and who God blesses. And there's a phrase in there that I've often come back to that says, this person keeps their oath even when it hurts. In other words, you make a promise and you keep it. You make a commitment, something better comes along, you still keep that commitment. So where do you need to keep your commitment or revisit a commitment you've made that you've started to waffle on? That's kind of the intent. That's what Jesus is getting behind here. Keep your word. Be a person of integrity. That's what it means to represent Jesus. Here's the weekly word, Matthew 5, beginning in verse 38, another challenging little passage from the Sermon on the Mount. You have heard that it was said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. Jesus quotes from the Old Testament, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, the whole idea of, lex talionis, they call. That's really, a common legal principle. That's what justice is. And Jesus is saying here, your fight is not really a fight for justice. Now, he's not laying down a legal institution here. He's not saying this is necessarily how government should run, how the law system should run. He's saying individually, here's a way to operate. Do not fight for your rights. And I can recall as a child hearing this being discussed in a Bible study, an adult Bible study, and a lot of us teens were there too. And whenever this passage came up, someone would invariably say, yeah, but it doesn't mean you need to be a doormat. And I look at this passage and I say, it kind of sounds like it to me. Well, this passage does contain what we call hyperbole. Jesus is, making a point with shock value. Someone smacks him in the cheek, turn the other also. I mean, you're going to get it again on that cheek. Someone sues you and gets, your shirt or your coat, hand over the rest of your clothing, really. It's hyperbole. Forcing you to go 1 mile, going 2 miles. This referred probably to the Roman custom of, conscripting people to help carry military loads for a mile at a time. And Jesus saying, don't resist that. And then on the personal financial level, helping people who need help, asking those who ask you to borrow, handing it over to them. So he's really making this one point with all these little illustrations. He's making this one point. He's saying, there's what's legal and just. And you can get all hung up on fighting for these things, but he's saying that's not your fight. Your law really doesn't get into it here, other places. Your law is the law of love. What does love dictate? It doesn't mean that when someone hears we're following the truth of this passage, they keep coming and we keep handing over all our money till we have nothing, because we're called to care for our families. It doesn't mean that we, allow people to rob us blind, because of course we're stewards. But it does say that we shouldn't get so obsessed about personal rights and what is just that we seek an equal recompense for every wrong done against us. It really protects us from a life focused on vengeance. And as we read in Romans, the Lord says, quoting from the Old Testament, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." And so in a sense, this is part of that same tone of teaching, to take our hands off anything resembling revenge, not to fight back in a fighting from our rights kind of way on the personal level, and allow God to break in and see what he can do. And this applies primarily, again, to personal situations, not the larger legal system. I had a friend who grew up in a home where it was known that they were of a persuasion they didn't sue. And so he saw his father being taken advantage of again and again and again. And he decided when he was older, as he did, that whenever people wronged him, he would sue. And as long as I knew him, he was always in a lawsuit, because he kind of took this the other way and he started fighting for his rights and going for revenge. And that's what Jesus wants to protect us from here. Open-handed, all our stuff, our reputation, our possessions. Don't fight for it. He's got our backs. Do you have enemies? Who do you consider an enemy? This passage talks about it. Matthew chapter 5, verse 43 for this week's weekly word says, "You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect." In a way, this kind of sums up a lot of the other little snippets and commands from chapter 5. Where we've talked about murder and adultery and divorce and oaths and eye for an eye. And Jesus pulls it all together and says, okay, bottom line, love your enemies. Love your enemies. Love them. Pray for them. And of course, Jesus modeled this himself on the cross. And basically saying that this aligns us with the Father. This aligns us with the Father, who does express love, concretely bring love and care and provision, sun and rain, to everyone, regardless of how good or bad they are. Jesus says, just loving people who love you, everybody does that. So that's baseline. Everybody does that already. He says, I'm calling you to a higher standard of love. Therefore, I'm including your enemies in this. Interesting, in verse 47, he talks about greeting, not just loving, but greeting. If you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Greeting people is actually an act of love. I often, in a local church context, point this out, that greeting someone instills value. It says you value them. They're not invisible. And, greeting someone in the store or on the street, or just giving a nod to someone who you might be of a different social strata or a street person, really does communicate love in a way that often love is not communicated. And then, as if this is not all enough, he says in verse 48, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. After talking about murder and adultery, divorce, oaths, eye for eye, amping it up, love your enemies, he says, okay, bottom line, be perfect. What he's saying is, this is parallel to the verses that say, be holy as God is holy. It's basically saying, live out your representation of God. You're children of the Most High God. Represent him well. Represent him well to people. Act towards people as he would. This is really almost a what would Jesus do kind of passage. Who would Jesus be? How would Jesus act in relation to these people? That's what you're called to be, and that's what you're called to do. So maybe a very simple application right now is to pause, take 30 seconds, pray for an enemy or someone who you know is opposed to you or someone who you know is causing you grief. Ask for God's blessing on them. And in doing so, you're lining yourself with the heart of Jesus.